Hello, my name is Joel Jakubowski. Welcome to today's training. Today's training is Addiction 101, which basically means we're going to try to encompass a broad view of addiction, how to understand it. It's a very complex condition because addiction really primarily affects the brain of the user. And of course, we understand that the brain is the most complex organism on the planet. And it affects all the different domains of our lives. So when the brain is not operating in a healthy or functional way, naturally neither will then we operate functionally or in a healthy way in the many domains of our life, socially, relationally, vocationally, and otherwise. And so it's a complex issue. We have a lot of information to help us to treat addiction. We have a moderate amount of information on what we believe is the causation of addiction. And so let's move into it. The first thing that's important to understand as a loved one of a person in addiction is that you should understand these 3 C's of empowerment. The first one is you cannot cause the addiction, you cannot control the addiction, and you cannot then also be the cure of the addiction. Those 3 C's have to be owned by the person who's experiencing the addiction. When entering into that treatment process or that treatment program, the person in active addiction has to own those 3 C's to understand that I have to own the cause, the level of control over it, and then what I'm going to do to remedy it. And so you cannot cause it, you cannot control it, and you cannot cure it. So my hope is that removes some shame, guilt, and disempowerment from you as the family member. So we know that we have a broad range of facts to talk about the scope of the problem. In our nation, we have about 23.2 million currently experiencing addiction. We know that 90% of U.S. citizens are experiencing addiction, either firsthand or secondhand. In other words, they know a person that's in addiction. I've personally never met the other 10%. They say they're out there. 67% of families are struggling with active addiction. So my hope is that for you, that helps to level the playing field a little bit so that you, who might be experiencing the addicted loved one, can understand that you are not alone. That, in other words, more than half of families in this nation, significantly so, 67%, are experiencing addiction. Well, thus far, for the last 16 years, from 2000 to 2016, we've lost approximately about 600,000 people. This is obviously an enormous amount of people. These are more deaths than we understand through things such as the Vietnam War, the AIDS epidemic, and this is not decreasing currently as we sit in 2018. Statistics are showing, and estimations from medical professionals and addiction professionals estimate another trend of at least 5 more years upwards until we get a handle and a plateau on this terrible affliction and epidemic. In our nation, what this basically means is about 8 people die an hour in our nation as a result of this, about 174 people a day. And in Pennsylvania, if you're a Pennsylvania resident, we know that in this state we lose someone about every 2 hours. And so obviously these can be very discouraging stats, but as treatment professionals, and my hope is that we're raising up and advocating you, that these would be the inspiration to counteract and to be full of zeal and passion to work actively against these stats as being individuals called to do so. Let's define addiction just according to the American Society of Addiction Medicine. They sum it up as basically being a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, and memory related to brain circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected by an individual pathology pursuing reward and/or relief by substance use and other behaviors. It's often characterized by the inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, cravings, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and interpersonal relationships, and a dysfunctional emotional response. So in that portion, what we're saying is the person continues to use despite the consequences. This becomes a very one-liner way to understand addiction. Naturally, a person that experiences adversity without the impairment of addiction generally will discontinue any process that has a natural consequence as a result of the pain or discomfort. But in addiction, we continue to use despite the pain and dysfunction, which seems to indicate that we're experiencing addiction and the condition of addiction. So I have coined over time basically a three-pack understanding of addiction. I believe that we're looking at here is a spiritual oppression, an emotional bankruptcy, and a neurobiological impairment. From a faith-based perspective, we believe that when we address the spiritual component, specifically by way of God of the Bible and a relationship with Jesus Christ, we believe that that encompassment in our life tends to, from top down, bring resolve and remedy to the emotional and cognitive and even neurobiological issues when we place our faith and concentration on our relationship with God, the call He has on our life, the purpose He has for our lives, as it was ordained from our mother's wombs. And so that's the success that we believe the long-term residential faith-based program brings to people experiencing addiction. And the statistics governmentally even prove that long-term residential faith-based, that combination, evidences empirically and governmentally the greatest chance of success and the greatest results for success for people experiencing substance abuse disorder or addiction. So what is a drug? Any substance taken to modify, change, or even heal in some cases. A chemical substance that affects the processes of the mind or body. A substance used recreationally for its effects, which are dissociative, feelings of euphoria. Alcohol is a drug. It's important to understand that. There are also many drugs that create a physical addiction as well as an emotional, mental, or spiritual, cognitive, soul-based addiction. And they assimilate to the body, and we'll talk about some of those. And all share the potential to be psychologically addictive, even though some include a physical addiction. They all have the potential to be psychologically addictive. Most commonly used drugs in our nation really are alcohol, marijuana, heroin, and opiates, crack and cocaine, methamphetamine, club drugs, which are really your designer drugs like ecstasy, and some of those kinds of drugs, hallucinogens, your LSD, mushrooms, and then, of course, prescription drugs and painkillers, and then, of course, solvents that we find can be anything that can be huffed to bring in those vapors, and it creates a dissociative feeling. Risk factors for addiction, in other words, the things that seem to point to the propensity for addiction. Growing up in an unpredictable or inconsistent environment becomes one of the number one factors. That's why for us in addiction treatment centers, especially long-term centers, what a large priority for us is trying to create an environment that is predictable and inconsistent, despite the certain inconsistencies that come from being an imperfect program, because we are run by imperfect entities called human beings. But our direction and our goal is to create, to the best of our ability through our humanity, an environment that is predictable and consistent for the residents of our program. Other risk factors are difficult temperaments and conduct disorders that just may exist in addition to the addiction itself. Poor social coping skills, perception of societal approval, if we feel as though we're a part of larger society or not a part of larger society, feelings of rejection when not feeling able to fit in or belong. Substance use in the home, the family seems to corroborate the usage, support or endorse chemical usage by their usage, by their substance abuse. So in other words, we grow up in a culture conducive to drug use. And then, of course, attachment, the theory of attachment, meaning to the degree at which we have attached through intimacy, love, and belonging with others just as a human being. And this happens from the womb on throughout our life. But the initial stages of attachment, which is where we create bonds with our caregivers, these point to some risk factors for addiction, meaning that the less degree of attachment that we have to someone, the intimacy, the belonging, and the sense of value and affirmation from those individuals seems to indicate a greater risk for addiction, because it raises then for us, of course, all kinds of emotional upheaval that tends to resolve itself in unhealthy ways occasionally. And one of those ways is chemical addiction, using addiction as a form of escapism or to numb the pain or to de-escalate the emotions that could be caused by a lack of that attachment. So for further reading, you just want to look up attachment theory. There are some really great books on attachment, and there are even some faith-based books on attachment. One is called God Attachment, which talks about attachment from a faith perspective as being most important with God as the source point for attachments with others. So there's a lot of great literature out there. So what are the protective factors, the things that seem to decrease the chance of our youth or anyone entering into an addictive process. Strong family bonds, which now speaks again, of course, to the attachment. A home that's operating in healthy mechanisms. Parental monitoring means that the parents or the caregivers of that individual have a great level of accountability and will speak into the life of the individual. And then that, of course, leads to the next one, which is actual involvement. Becoming involved, speaking to our children, providing education at a young age. We're hoping to see more of that in our schools. We see a moderate amount. We really need to see more. So parents' involvement in the process is hugely important to address the issues without the awkwardness of the conversation, challenging our children and our other family members to account for behaviors that could be conducive to addiction, patterns of behavior, lifestyle choices, the lack of motivation, these kinds of things. Positive social outlets. In other words, I've been able to attach to not only my first simple society, which is my family, but I'm able to start making larger society attachments. I'm part of things larger than myself outside of my home, and I feel a place in larger society, a sense of belonging, and a sense of purpose there, which is the natural progression for every human being, is to continue to grow and become a part of something larger than themselves. And of course, from a faith-based perspective, that we realize that the largest thing that we can become a part of beyond natural is the supernatural relationship with God, which helps to give clear direction and call and purposefulness in all of the natural larger things that we become a part of. Our jobs, military, anything like that outside our society, outside of our simple society, our home, which is really the first thing that we become part of larger than ourselves. And then, of course, early education and prevention that happens on all levels. Again, we see some of this happening in schools. It should be happening more formally. There are definitely some social groups and some outreach groups and community groups that now are trying to address early education and prevention, that not only come into schools but do community events that parents are encouraged to come to. And then, of course, parents getting education and seeking out groups, advocacy groups in their community, much like the trainings that we're doing here on addictions, enabling the myths of addiction, repairing relational wounds, reintegration of children back to the homes of addictive individuals. These kinds of things will be very helpful. Learning current drug trends, that's another one. And then, of course, having positive role models growing up, seeing people modeling healthy behavior, healthy decision making. That comes in a variety of forms. That can be a teacher at our schools. That could be a coach. That could be a pastor, a youth pastor. And, of course, it could be our parents, which is the one that would be most proximal to our lives, our caregivers, that are modeling healthy behavior, healthy decision-making, a healthy value system, honor and integrity, these kinds of things. And, of course, modeling not the use of drugs and alcohol as a means of escape or as a means of not confronting hard emotional issues or life's conditions. And then coping skills. Introducing coping skills into that young life as a parent or as a caregiver, helping. So remember, for us in addiction, everyone is coping with conflict being inevitable. And so we're all coping with conflict, but we all seem to cope with conflict in different ways. Some choose healthy ways, some choose unhealthy ways. So the parent's role, the caregiver's role, is to introduce healthy coping skills for life's urgencies and difficulties and unpredictabilities that do not then create a response that exacerbates an already existing natural problem with all kinds of unnatural problems. And, of course, that would be escapism into drugs and alcohol, and then all of the nature of culture that creates, which is even more increased levels of detriment and pain and discomfort. And so introducing coping skills, and specifically what we mean is healthy coping skills. These are all protective factors. So just some basic 3 C's of addiction, and we don't mean 3 C's of parental understanding, which were the first, which was the I can't cause it, I can't control it, and I can't cure it. This is kind of the nature of addiction. The 3 C's of addiction is we understand that addiction has compulsion. It's an obsessive behavior where the individuals who are addicted, they demonstrate this compulsive, obsessive behavior that exacerbates and is manifested by a bunch of bad habits. So we want to be careful about being able as a caregiver to try to, that's one of the identifiers, is compulsive or obsessive behavior. Control issues. This control refers to what happens after you start consuming or participating in the bad habit. Once started, people have no control, are able to set limits. We try to put all kinds of concessions around our usage. I'm only going to drink this much or use this much drugs, and then I'm only going to drink Friday night. And the person that's addicted, we also ultimately find out that we fail in those attempts to create boundaries or constraints and sanctions around our usage. So we begin to lose control, and of course that's certainly specific to the compulsion. And then, of course, we begin to experience all kinds of consequences. So we have the compulsion, the lack of control is really how it should be put as opposed to just control. And then, of course, the experiencing of the consequences. And these come as a result of our drug-induced behaviors and activities as this affect others, as it affects the many domains of our lives, unable to maintenance the demand of the addiction, and then at the same time maintenance all of the other areas of our life that require our maintenance. Vocationally, relationally, socially, we lose track of the maintenance that we need in those other areas of our lives. We focus solely, compulsively, and out of control on the drug of choice, and so naturally we begin to experience consequences. It's never the hope of any person in addiction to lose jobs, to lose engagements, to not show up at weddings and funerals, but who has time for those things when we are obsessively concentrated on that mood-regulating substance obsessively? And so we lose the ability to maintenance these other domains. If you ask anyone in addiction, it was never a malicious or intentional pursuit to lose any of those things. They're the natural consequences of a very unnatural behavior. So the stages of addiction, these can be broken down into 5 stages, but to sum them really up in 3 stages, we have experimentation and social use. There's a high number of individuals that will experiment at young ages, even 12 to 18. There's some stats out there that have it as the 90% status that individuals will experiment. It's interesting, though, for those that experiment with drug and alcohol addiction, a very low number in the teens, generally 17, 19, even lower in some studies, actually become addicted. So it's interesting. Experimentation does not always mean that the person will continue through the progression, but for many of us, we do. And so experimentation is just a voluntary use of drugs without experiencing any of the negative or social legal consequences. For us, experimenting, we really see it as having fun. We can look back on our lifestyle of addiction before there were consequences, and it appears to be a social mechanism. It's what's at the party. It's what we do as social recreation. And we certainly see that in our media and in our culture. We certainly see that alcohol is used for social recreation. And for some, it can remain that, but for some, it cannot, because it can then lead to regular use. Doesn't necessarily have to lead to regular use, but it can. So the frequency will begin to increase, and then we lead into the second stage, which is abuse. This is generally defined as a continued use, where we're going to separate that from stage 3, which is a compulsive use, which we talked about previously. It is a continued use of drugs despite the legal and social and domain consequences. In other words, what began as a temporary source of maybe pleasure and then maybe even into even escape, realizing that through this continued use, when I use, I don't really have to experience the emotions that are associated with some of the realities of life. And so what ends up happening, it goes from this temporary form of escape and quickly leads into more serious problems. And the warning signs for that is we start to notice that we're getting cravings, or we get a preoccupation with the drug, and we get symptoms maybe of depression, irritability, or fatigue if we're not using. And again, the frequency begins to increase. We find that we were using occasionally, maybe just on weekends, and the experimentation is just social life. We now find that we're using regularly, and it almost appears that there's some level of a maintenance over life's conditions. And we could be using several days per week, even during the day. And on another signature is that things are starting to progress and could be leading towards addiction, is we're beginning to use or drink alone. And this is where we start to see some changes are occurring. Another thing that we start to see here is that maybe our lifestyle changes are changing, maybe our social habits are changing, maybe our choice of friendships are changing, our sleep patterns, maybe eating habits, these kinds of things. And then finally we come into the final stage, which can be split up into a couple different stages, but essentially it's drug addiction and dependency. And so what are we talking about when we say addiction versus dependency? When we say addiction, we're really talking about the lifestyle of addiction, the risky behaviors, the culture of addiction, the whole social life created around. In other words, we created an entire lifestyle, or better yet, a death style, around the usage. And so this really becomes the drug addiction itself, and that's the compulsive use. But we also see, and then again, what we recognize is that is happening, that compulsive use, that drug addiction, despite the consequences. We are continuing to use even though we're experiencing a slew of negative consequences, loss of jobs, loss of relationships, hospitalization, legal issues, mental health issues, financial issues. And so that's the compulsive use associated with the drug addiction. But when we're talking about the dependency, what we start to notice is the body is beginning to assimilate to the drug, especially with some drugs more than others. Drugs like alcohol, benzodiazepine, and heroin has a great level of physical dependency that's starting to come in, which creates withdrawal symptoms. So in other words, when I'm not using, I'm experiencing feelings of sickness, agitation, sweats, nausea, heat, body heat increases. And so these are the kinds of things that signify that we're probably in that third stage of addiction where the body has assimilated to the drugs physically. So now when I'm not using, there's a craving in me that's not just psychological any longer. It's the body literally saying, if I don't use, the message is going to the user is I'm going to die. And so the withdrawal symptoms are horrendous. And so we use to overcome the physical. At this point, generally, especially because of the withdrawal symptoms, withdrawal requires, and the body's negative reaction to not use is happening almost daily in most cases. So now what we're seeing is it's really become continuous use, where really our entire day is designed around usage. And that's how we can be sure that we're into these final stages of addiction. And everything is about avoiding pain, depression, escaping the realities of life, and we just become out of control. It takes over and really begins to run the show. There's a manual that's used by treatment professionals and clinicians and psychiatric association called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. There's several versions of this that have come out over the years. The DSM-5 is using, and this is even now even a little outdated. There's been some amendments to this, but they have a category called substance use disorder. So here we see addiction being described more as a disorder. We certainly know there's a medical description. We certainly can view addiction certainly as purely a spiritual affliction. But some of the criteria for substance use disorder include some of the things we've talked about. Developing a tolerance. In other words, we have to use more to experience the same high that we were once experiencing with moderate usage or minimal usage. We now find that we have to use more of our drug of choice to get to that same level of high. So it's creating a tolerance. The body is learning to adjust. And so that's how we can be sure we're into this disorder. We continue to use more and more to only experience really the same effects of the earlier usage. And so tolerance, withdrawal now is starting to happen. This is an indication that we could be experiencing substance use disorder, or better yet, SUD. We're using more than we intended, inability to control the usage. Some of the things we talked about before. We're taking risk behavior or expanded efforts to obtain the substance. Maybe we're driving 25 miles to get a little bit of drugs, or we're going into all kinds of risky environments. And so another one is that we become socially, occupationally, and recreationally focused, purely focused on everything revolves around substance use, or those things are replaced by substance use. So where I once had a social life or occupational life or vocational life or recreational activities, I've abandoned those, and now really everything is determined by substance use. So for some of us in addiction, or even if you're a person who's coming out of addiction, a lot of times it looks like someone saying, hey, listen, Joel, this weekend we're going camping. Well, my first preoccupation is if they're going to be my drug of choice there. If my drug of choice isn't going to be there and I can't bring it, I'm not going. Because I'm not going to go away for 3 days and be away from my drug of choice for a weekend when I can wait on the dealer and just sit around my house. I'll go camping with my drug of choice in my living room. And that's what ends up happening. It takes over. If the drug can't be a part of it, then I can't be a part of it. And this is where we start to see our family obligations waning, because if I come to the funeral or the wedding and I bring my drug of choice, which means I'm going to bring the high, I'm probably going to get repelled by my family. So if I can't have my drug of choice there, I'm probably not going there. It is my mood regulating substance. Where it goes, I go. And when it's available, I'm available, unless it's not welcomed in those environments. And again, we're back to the final stage of what the DSM-5 calls continued use despite the persistent physical, psychological, family, social, employment, and legal problems. Continuing to use anyway. For the diagnostic stat, they say that if a person, to get a good idea whether a person is actually in substance use disorder, clinically, is on that list that I just gave you, we're looking for 2 or 3 of those means that there's mild substance use disorder, if they meet 2 or 3 of those criteria that we just discussed. 4 or 5 for moderate chance of substance use disorder, they're in a moderate stage of that. And if 6 of these can be established, and I give about 7, if 6 or more, it's a severe condition. That means they're deeply entrenched in addiction or substance use disorder. So there's a career cycle of addiction that the person gets into every time they use. We go through a process of hustling, copying, getting high, and avoiding the consequences. Hustling means I have to meet the demand of the addiction, and the demand is greater than my individual ability to sustain it. So once I've worked through all of my resources to get the need met, the demand is still on me, well past my resources. So naturally, that's going to cause me to start using the resources of others. And this is where we can start to see activity like criminal behavior, stealing, manipulation, deception. Then that leads us into a process of copying. Once I have hustled for the resource, whether that's something I can trade with the dealer, trade with the pawn shop, or cash itself, I then cop and get the drug of choice. Then I go into a process of getting high, the 3rd stage of the career cycle of addiction. And chances are I'm probably getting high under the resources of someone else, and someone else's home, whether it be my parents or someone else who's probably paying the bills. So all my basic needs are being met through the resources of others vicariously, so that every dime and every resource I have can continue to go to the drug of choice and to support my addiction. So the last stage of this process between the hustling, the copying, and the getting high is now I have to avoid the consequences. In many cases, remember I said I'm getting high probably under the caregiver and resources of someone else. That in itself helps me to avoid the consequences. If I have no phone bill, water bill, electric bill, food bill, housing bill, and someone else is paying that, well, that immediately helps me to avoid the consequences. Avoiding the consequences may mean that I have to figure out how I'm now going to get the money to get to work for gas money, how I'm going to pay my cell phone bill because I've just spent all of my money on my drug of choice. It may mean having to call the boss and say, hey, listen, I'm going to be sick today because I can't go to work. I'm hungover, or maybe I'm even too far from my job, holed up somewhere that my usage has taken me over the weekend. And so what I need is I need other people. I need the loved ones. I need folks like yourself to help me avoid the consequences by calling the boss, by paying my bills, by giving me a place to live. So parents often make the mistake of trying to get into this addictive cycle of hustling, copying, getting high, and avoiding the consequences by getting into the hustling part, or getting to trying to find me at the crack house, or flushing my drugs down the toilet so I can't get high. In most cases, that's futile. That's not going to create any change in me. What creates change in the user is no longer allowing the person in usage to avoid the consequences. When I'm caused to experience the consequences of my addiction, it motivates a choice for change because pain motivates change. But if you as the loved one keep removing my consequences and only ever have logical reasoning conversations with me, or do pleading, threatening, or bargaining with me, and just tell me how bad my problem is, but don't give me any ultimatums or any conditions for change, the addiction in me will just continue to argue with you forever as I just return back in the morning, as I got through all the consequences with your help, so in the morning I can return right back to hustling, copying, getting high, and using you again to avoid the consequences, which gets me back to the morning of hustling, copying, getting high. And as you well know, now that maybe I've broadened your view of this as the loved one, you didn't intentionally ask or intend for me to return to a lifestyle of addiction. We don't know what we don't know, and that's the point of trainings like these, to educate you and families to understand that there is a role that you play in this cycle that actually exacerbates and allows for my ability to continue to use. And so the only role really for parents is to no longer be in that 4th stage of helping to avoid the consequences and recognizing how am I supporting the addiction, where I feel like I'm just supporting my loved one, but what I'm really supporting is the addiction, and I'm not really motivating them for a decision for change. I'm actually to some degree keeping them sick in their addiction, or soul sick in their addiction. So as families, we have to start recognizing what are the ways that I'm actually helping the person avoid the consequences when I should be holding them accountable to the consequences. And so causes of addiction, this becomes a whole barrel of monkeys trying to figure out what the cause is. So the questions would be, what causes people to initiate and continue behaviors even though they're often very destructive? How can these behaviors be changed or controlled to help the involved persons achieve better health and well-being. There is no real commonly or universally accepted answer for why a person enters into addiction or how to treat it. There's no universal answer. The answer is always bio, psycho, social, spiritual. Seems to be the 3-pack or 4-pack bio, psycho, social, spiritual 4-pack combination of what initiates a decision for usage and enters the person into addiction, and then those same areas are what we're trying to bring resolve to biologically, sociologically, and spiritually to remedy the addiction. Naturally, from a faith-based program, we start from the spiritual component down, specifically giving an author to that faith, God of the Bible, creating a relationship with that, and then working through the other domains to bring about the resolve. So for us, the universal remedy for us is through a faith-based mechanism, specifically with God of the Bible. But there are 1,000 different paths that people choose to abstain from drugs and alcohol, get to a place of sobriety, and then move on to whatever other domains in their life they see as an acceptable way to live their life. We believe that we're called to a purpose and a calling by God, and that has always been the sole purpose of our life, and that's what brings about the success and the peace and the freedom in the other domains, is starting from top down. And so let's look at what some of the causes are from some of those points of view, the biopsychosocial spiritual model. The medical model describes it as a chronic, progressive, relapsing, or potentially fatal disease. In other words, if something doesn't come between that person and their drug of choice, there's a great potential that they will perish in that. Now, that can apply to all of the different viewpoints. We certainly understand that that's true of addiction, that something has to come between that person and their drug of choice, some level of intervention. And so from the medical perspective, they do not see, this perspective does not sees addiction as a lifelong, incurable thing that can be arrested but cannot be cured. There's a management for this disease, is how addiction is understood. And that's the key, is to find a management of disease. And when a person is managing the disease is not winning them over. It would be similar to how we view remission in a cancer situation. So this looks at genetics, brain reward mechanisms, altered brain chemistry, and the idea of that person then self-medicating. So we certainly know, no matter what our view of addiction, whether we see it as purely medical or purely spiritual or purely mental health disorder, we can accurately measure that there is a change in brain functioning from every perspective. So even from a faith-based perspective, we still understand that the brain needs to heal, and there's been some habits formed in the neurobiology. But we truly believe that Jesus and a relationship with God can bring about the management to bring about those changes, and that God himself can heal the mind and can heal the soul of the individual. And so we keep moving forward and look at this from a clinical or psychological perspective. This is where we get the word disorder. And so from this focuses in terms of treatment on the personal needs and personality traits of the person abusing the substances. So now you can see it's a very interpersonal view. It's really very person-centered in terms of the psychological manifestation of the person. So the two categories that falls under is the categories that emphasize the rewards derived from the usage of the mood-altering drugs that tend to perpetuate their usage. It causes the person to continue to use based on that reward system. When I use this thing, I feel a sense of fulfillment, whether it's appropriate or inappropriate, healthy or unhealthy. There's a message that goes to my mind that this is producing for me a reward, even though it may be taking my life. So this clinical or psychological view wants to address what is the basis for the understanding of this thing as a reward, and what are the natural and healthy rewards that life provides. And so the other category that it focuses on are those categories stressing that substance abusers have different personalities that have different personalities from those who abstain. And so the idea there is that there's perhaps an addictive personality that exists in the person that has a propensity for usage, which can come through all kinds of those risk factors that we talked earlier that can be nurtured in that individual and brought about as a result of some of the unpredictable, inconsistent environment, usage in the home. There's some, even from the medical perspective, there's some genetics that may speak to that. And in other words, there are some personalities that seem to gravitate towards drug use. And so there's all kinds of viewpoints on that happen from a psychological order. Because remember, we're looking at this from a mental health condition only. And so this is broken down into reinforcement processes, positive reinforcement, pain avoidance, and drug cues, things that cue drug use. So these are some of the areas that get addressed in the clinical counseling, is where's the positive reinforcement going to come from based on some of the negative reinforcers to not use. Where are we trying to find pain avoidance? The signature of usage is that we're using it to avoid pain or strong emotional feelings. So how are we going to start addressing areas of pain and discomfort in healthy ways? And let's start recognizing what are the cues that cause us to use. It could be people, it can be places, it can be things, it can be stressful circumstances, it can be triggers. What are the cues that we can start addressing? In terms of the personality traits, the remedy there that we try to find from a clinical perspective is how are some of these emotional problems, these personality traits, how are they linked to the emotional problems or inadequacies that may have been taught or learned in our upbringing, our social experiences, our feelings of man's approval or lack of people approval, failures and successes, being able to attach to a sense of belonging and with adequacy to larger society. So the personality traits are being linked to some of these emotional problems and inadequacies. And how can we begin to become personally strong? You know, sometimes we see this through what we call strength-based treatment, where we try to look at what are the strengths of the individual and focus on those to hopefully overcompensate for some of maybe the ongoing emotional or weaknesses that every human being has. But in this case, those weaknesses tend to point to drug use. And so we're trying to be very careful there. And so from a social perspective, this focuses on situations, social relationships, social structures related to substance abuse. So that can be peers, family, media, society at large, anything that's socially that tends to influence our usage. And so this can happen through social learning. So in other words, we're exposed to person who model behaviors that are conducive to drug usage, drug culture. That leads us then, of course, to that subculture perspective that the drug is expected or encouraged for use to have a level of acceptance in those social circles. So in other words, I use because that's the standard of the culture. It's one of the habits and the rituals within the culture. And so then there's something called socialization where the user's own values and activities are compatible with the use of others. And so not only is it part of the culture, but let's say it's part of the social construct that happens with my wife and I. And so we actually are finding socialization through that, where we're going into environments that maybe drinking is the social norm of something that's not maybe drug using. We're not there to be drug users, but in that environment, that's the social norm. So socialization begins to indoctrinate a person to minimize any harm or any fear that might be connected to drug or alcohol usage. And then social control is where we talked about earlier with the control model, with the compulsion, the control, and the consequences, is in the social life, in the social aspect of the life. There's an absence of social control requiring conformity that leads to the usage. So there's no restraints. The restraints come off the individual, and we're finding ourselves not able to activate the boundaries of when the drinking should stop because I have to get up in the morning. So the socialization leads then to a lack of boundaries on, okay, I've got to be able to see my social life as one of the many domains of my life and not the one primary domain where everything goes through my social life, and that's often where we derive pleasure, is from our social life. And so I lose control and I stay in that process and begin to step outside of my own boundaries. Other things that are influenced socially, of course, is social, economic, or political factors. This could be things like unemployment, poverty, racism, family breakdown, feelings of powerlessness. All these things can lead to usage. They're just the social realities of life, and sometimes the social trials and qualms of life that cause and to stimulate usage, especially when we think about finding ourselves purposeless outside of employment. Or maybe we grew up in a home of poverty, so it seems to be that we're in the category, the B team, of the have-nots versus the haves. So that creates all kinds of parallels of how we view others in terms of having a level of gratitude for what we do have. We tend to create a level of anxiety, angst, or envy for what we don't have. That raises all kinds of things. Racism Racism suggests that my very being is lesser than another's, or even believe that we're greater than another's. And then, of course, the breakdown of the family, which we can link to all kinds of social issues. And many will tell you that the initial breakdown of the family is what served as a forerunner, or what served to exacerbate this opiate epidemic, is that we lost the continuity and the condition and the accountability and the value system of family, even in terms of just eating around the same table, sharing intimacies as the first simple, powerful society, discussing our days and our issues. Now everyone is eating on the run and independent of that home, not sharing that intimacy. When the family breaks down, value systems break down, and value systems start to become very independent and not group-oriented where there's accountability. No accountability, and we find recklessness. And so this is a whole other dynamic that we believe exacerbated the opiate epidemic, was the breakdown of the family. So from a spiritual, faith-based perspective, we believe addiction, if it's even we see it as a disease-oriented thing, is the direct result of sin entering into humanity back in the inception of humanity and one's separation from God. We believe that addiction, like anything, can be resolved through a reconnection to God. We do not believe that addiction in itself is sinful per se. The manifestations have a sin component because they involve deception, criminality, etc. But we do not believe, when we say that addiction is not sinful, we're not saying that it's the result of a person being a bad person. The Bible says all we like sheep have gone astray and all have turned to their own way. So to some degree we can say all of us has a sin condition. So certainly in the addicted person, we understand that there is a sin nature and a propensity for sin in our lives. The Bible clearly tells us that the heart is wicked above all things. And so without restraint or control, and without a relationship with God and a connection to God, we would say that that part of our life can run amok. So we certainly see how that can run amok in all different areas of our life, and we understand that addiction is certainly one of them. We believe that we find a reunion back with God, with that we find great resolve, we return to a calling and a purpose, the original design for our lives, that there is a relationship, a real tangible relationship as a connection of something larger than ourselves. So think of it even in terms of the very successful 12-step programs that have been helping people throughout generations. They understand the concept from a spiritual perspective of a higher power. Keyword, higher than power. A power greater than ourselves. And there's a moderate level of success that a person can have to find freedom, or at least not freedom, but sobriety from chemical usage. From a faith-based perspective, we believe that there is a higher power, but it has an author and a designer, and it has a personhood, and that is God in the form of Jesus Christ and by way of the Holy Spirit filling. And we believe that only God can really produce a true freedom from addiction, something more than just a sobriety or an abstinence. We believe that Jesus can remove the compulsion to use, and that this is something that is based on a relationship and not a set of rules or processes or procedures per se, but based on a relationship that instructs us in those processes. That the first affiliation is to the relationship, not to the rules, not to the steps, but to that higher power, which is God. So we understand it as a separation from God, which creates hopelessness, isolation, and fear. We see it as the effects of sin, just in our humanity: emotional dysfunction, family breakdown, fear, anxiety, rebellion. We certainly understand that, and we even see it now genetically in medical terms, but there's an understanding that generational curses can come down through families that happen through unresolved sin issues. So we see that generationally it does seem to come into families where there was initially a separation of God that seems to come down through the lineage of the family. And then, of course, it can be, we see that there's a lack of a biblical value system. And if I don't follow a biblical value system, then in most cases there's really only two value systems that I can follow: a man-crafted value system or a self-crafted value system, or I can choose a value system ordained by God, which we clearly see orchestrated and written out for us in the Word of God. So the alternative would be my own value system, which unfortunately can lead us into a sense of kingship, which leads to a sense of pride and entitlement. And so if I am the author of my value system, in other words, and I can make the rules for my value system, so in other words, I keep my value system doesn't keep me. And as a believer, as a person of God, we believe that our value system is ordained for us by something greater than us that keeps us. And so this is how we view the spiritual component. As we wrap up here, just simply, what are some of the consequences of addiction? Well, it's all the domains. It's physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, relational, social, occupational, financial. Because addiction, because it affects the brain, as we said in the beginning, breaks down all the domains of our lives. How is addiction addressed? We can do it voluntarily when it becomes self-motivated to seek out help, which is, believe it or not, probably less common than the second one here, which is intervention or involuntary, meaning that we are going to need to be motivated out of that complexity of spiritual oppression, emotional bankruptcy, and neurobiological change. We need to be motivated out of that because we get stuck. So that can happen. We can involuntarily come into treatment centers through the criminal justice system, children and youth services, employee assistance programs from our job, because those are all the areas we begin to break down. Society responds and says, you are mandated to help. And this is not uncommon for individuals that enter into our programs in this regard, which is wonderful that God used these external motivations. Then, of course, there's intervention where the family gets involved through external motivation. The most success for intervention is family intervention, and this, of course, is another form of external motivation. So we see it can happen voluntarily, involuntarily, where it's mandated, and then by intervention, and most commonly and most successfully through families. So what happens if the person doesn't experience treatment and doesn't get into a place of change? It's progressive and ongoing. It will continue progressing, get worse. The compulsive behaviors continue to progress. Something has to come into that process. One of those factors we talked about before, legal, criminal, family, God himself can come in at any moment and create a road to Damascus experience with someone if he sees fit, but something has to come between that person and the usage. The person in addiction cannot change on their own. It does require some kind of social dynamics, help from others, pastoral care, relational care, some behavioral help, some social help. It requires to get into a process of change that's formal. There's not great success that a person trying to do it on their own can do it on their own. It requires being immersed into some level of healthy dependency on some level of support or treatment. Once addicted, the individual has moved into a different state of being. That's the whole issue here, and we're trying to return them from their inauthentic self, the addicted self, back to the authentic self as God intended. It requires a great level of help to do so, and without treatment, it is unlikely that they will step out of the inauthentic self without some form of intervention back to the authentic self that they were intended to be. And so one of the things I think is important to understand, and the last thing I want to say, is that there's a lot of stigma attached to addiction because it's still considered a bad person thing. I mentioned earlier that 23.2 million individuals are suffering in this nation with chemical addiction. It's remarkable and outstanding to know that only 10% are getting help. So why? A lot of it is because we still are in the shadows and we're not coming forward in transparency to say, hey, listen, I have this issue. Parents and families are feeling as though the world will see them as bad people, bad parents. And so we have to be careful with that. You know, the first parent that ever had children that made some bad choices was God, Adam and Eve. So if Adam and Eve, God's kids, can make some bad choices, our kids can too. It doesn't mean that they're bad people. It means that we can go astray and make some choices that can become very dangerous and very all-encompassing and ensnaring in our lives. And so we have to be able to address addiction as a condition that can be resolved, that can be treated, and that we can find freedom from. And so I would implore you to be an advocate and to help others, and I hope that this has helped you to understand that we're experiencing a condition and that it can be handled well and appropriate. And my hope is that you can understand that it is not a direct result of the fact that you have been a bad parent or a bad person. There's never been one parent who has done everything right or everything wrong. And because of that, if we know that parents can be flawed sometimes and make mistakes, well, if that's what we know about parenting, well, then why isn't every child addicted? That would be the condition for addiction for everyone. It's not. So our children make willful decisions or beyond our control because we don't have control over our children. We try to influence good decision-making and deter bad decision-making and pray. Those are the powers we have. So my hope is that you will get back to the very first part of this and understanding that you cannot cause the addiction, you cannot control the addiction, and you cannot cure it. that we are just trying to get educated to motivate our loved ones to make a choice for that. And at the same time, as loved ones of the addicted, is to stay healthy and have a healthy life independent of the choices of our addicted loved one. Look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you for your time. Prayers are with you and for you. In Jesus' name.